In this first section, we're going to learn how to test controllers. Since controllers are the heart of any Angular application, it makes sense that we should learn how to test those first. So I've chosen the eventless controller to be the controller that we're going to test. I chose this one for one very important reason, and that is it's only doing a few things, so we only have to write a couple of tests. This lets us focus on the process of testing controllers without getting bogged down in the details of what this controller actually does. So looking at this controller, we can see that it does two things. First, it sets up the events object on the scope. It does this by calling eventData.getAllEvents. So now there's one action I can test. The next action is this navigate to details function. When this function gets called, it navigates to a new URL. The path to that URL is based on the parameter that's passed into the function. So I want to write a test to make sure that location.url is called with the correct parameter. So now that I know what I want to test, let's go to our test file and set up some tests. You can see that I've created an empty file here. I put it underneath the unit folder inside of the test folder. This again is using Jasmine tests. If you have never used Jasmine before or you need a refresher course, please refer to my course on testing client-side JavaScript and watch the Jasmine module. So the first thing I want to do is test that the events property is set up correctly. So looking back at my code, I can see that it's set to the result of eventData.getAllEvents. So I want to write a test that verifies that the events object is set to the result of eventData.getAllEvents. So I want to set up a fake events object that gets returned by that getAllEvents call. So I'm going to create a variable called mockEvents, and I'll set that to the value of some object. So now I want to write an expectation that the scope.events is that object. Now one of the things I want to do while I'm authoring this test is watch the results of running this test to see when it's failing and when it's passing. My Karma is not connected, so I'm going to stop it and start it again. That will allow Karma to run my test, and of course it's failing because I'm not finished authoring this test yet. So the first thing we'll notice is I'm getting an error because the scope object isn't defined. So let's define that variable. I'm going to define that above the it in the describe because I'm going to modify that in my before each. The next problem I've got is that I don't actually have my controller created. But before I can create the controller, I've got to have a controller constructor given to me by Angular that lets me construct a controller and inject the dependencies I want to inject. So I do that by getting hold of a special Angular object that allows me to create controllers. So I'm going to create a before each function. And in this before each function, I want to ask Angular to give me that special object that I can use to construct controllers. The way that I ask Angular that is with the inject function, which is a global function inside of my tests. The reason that function is global in my tests is because in my Karma configuration, if you'll remember, I included all of the Angular libraries from the test lib directory. And the one that sets up these special test functions is called Angular mocks. That library creates a special global function called inject. Then I can ask Angular to give me Angular objects. And the object that I want is called $controller. This object will let me construct a controller. The problem though is that I don't want to construct my controller inside of my before each loop. I want to construct it inside my test. That way in each test I can use different mock dependencies for the controller. So I'm going to go up and create a new variable called controller constructor, and I'm going to prefix it with the $sign to remind myself that this is an Angular object. Then I go down into my before each and set that variable equal to the controller parameter. Now that I've got that variable, I can construct my controller inside of my test. I do that by calling this like a function and passing in the name of the controller I want to construct. In this case, since we're testing the eventless controller, I'm going to pass in the string eventless controller. This function takes in a second parameter, and that is an object that matches up to the dependencies of the controller so that I can provide mock dependencies. Let's go back and look at that controller and see the dependencies that it takes. This controller takes three dependencies: scope, location, and event data. So I'm going to go back in here, and for now, I'm going to set each of those variables to an empty object. Now that I've got this set up, I can save and run the test, but I know it's going to fail because the scope object I'm referencing inside of that expect isn't actually set to the scope object of the controller. Instead, what I've got to do is provide the controller an actual scope object. But I can't just provide any object at all. What I need to do is ask Angular to give me a scope object. So I'm going to go back to my before each function, and I'm going to add on a second parameter called root scope. Again, because of the inject function, Angular is going to provide me a root scope object. Now that I've got a root scope object, I can create a scope object off of that. I do that by calling the $new function on the root scope object. And now that I've got a scope object, I can go back down to my controller and pass in that object. And now that I've got this going, let's save and run the test and see what happens. Okay, my test is still failing, and let's see what the reason is. Okay, the failure message that I'm getting is that eventless controller is not a function. The reason for that is Angular hasn't loaded up my module that defines the eventless controller. So I'm going to go back into my test, and I'm going to bring in the module that defines my controller. I do that with another before each function that utilizes another special Angular function called module. And I pass into the module function a parameter that's the name of the module that I want it to load. In this case, events app, which is the name of the module for our application. Now I'll save and run the tests again. We're still failing. Let's look at the message and see why. Okay, object has no method getAllEvents. If I look at my controller, I can see that event data is supposed to be an object that has a method called getAllEvents. But if I go back to my spec, I can see that the event data that I'm passing in is just an empty object. So of course it has no method called getAllEvents. So let's provide a mocked event data object that will have a method called getAllEvents that we can control and have it pass back whatever value we want, which in this case is going to be the mock events object. So I'm going to go back to my before each function and add another line of code where I'm going to set up this mock event data object. I'm going to use signon.stub to set up that object and give it one function called getAllEvents. Then I just go up and declare that variable. Then I can go down into my test and provide that as the event data object. Now I'll save and run the test again. Okay, I'm still getting a failure, and we can see here the error message is expected undefined to be an empty object. The reason is that this mock event data's getAllEvents object is returning undefined, and I want it to return my mock event data object. So I'm going to go back to my test, and I'm going to add a line and tell the mock event data object to return my mock events object whenever somebody calls getAllEvents. Now let's save and run this test again. Great, now our test is passing. So you can see one of the fantastic benefits of using Angular is that we can provide mock objects for every dependency the controller has. This controller had 3 dependencies, and I was able to provide exactly the objects I wanted in order to make the test go the way that I want it to go, and to test that controller running a very specific scenario. Now that that test is passing, let's go back to our controller and look at the other thing that we want to test, which is the navigate-to-details method. The thing I want to test about this method is that it uses the correct URL whenever you call it. So let's write a new test. Now in order to run this test, I still have to construct my controller. But after the controller has been constructed, it's created the scope object, and I want to call the navigate-to-details method on the scope object. Looking back at the controller, that method takes in an event parameter. So I'm just going to put in a placeholder at the moment, and now I'm going to set up my expectation. I want to check that the URL is correct. The best way to do that is to check this line right here, the call to the URL function, and see what parameter is passed in. So I want to create a mock location object that will let me do that. And I want to check that that URL is called with a specific value. In this case, let's say that the event that we're passing in has an ID of 23. That would produce a URL of event 23. Now there's a couple of problems that are going to cause this test to fail. The first problem is I don't have a mock location object. The second problem is the event object that I'm passing into the call to navigate to details doesn't exist yet. So let's create that object. And since I'm using an event with an ID of 23, I'll give this an ID of 23. Now we also need to create a mock location object. That object has one function that I care about, the URL function. Now that I've got the mock location created, I want to provide that for the location parameter for this controller. Now let's run the test and see if it passes. Great, our test passed immediately. Just for fun, let's change the value of the ID and watch the test fail. And now the test is failing because the URL function was not called with the correct parameter. This is the basics of unit testing controllers with Angular. Notice how simple it is using Angular's dependency injection and sign-on to create mock objects so that we can provide a test that causes our controller to execute exactly the scenario that we want to test. This is one of the features that makes Angular such a powerful framework. When unit testing, we can truly isolate each of our components and test it exactly the way we want to test it. We don't have to worry about complex dependencies that are difficult to set up. We can use mock objects set up exactly the way we want to in order to test our controllers in very specific situations. This is the magic of dependency injection, a technique that has long been used on the server side in order to make code testable.